July 1960, Nevada desert, 104 degrees. A 59-year-old man with a damaged heart, a history of heavy drinking, and 18 years of unresolved grief climbed onto the back of a wild Mustang with no stunt double waiting on the sideline. The horse bucked. The man held on. The crew watched in silence because they had already learned that asking him to stop was a waste of breath. His name was Clark Gable. He had survived poverty and Hollywood and a world war and the death of the only woman he had ever loved. He had come through all of it, and now he was here. In the same Nevada desert where Carole Lombard's plane had gone down in 1942, doing the most physically punishing work of his entire career, at an age when most men had long since stopped proving anything to anyone. The question nobody on set wanted to ask out loud was a simple one. Was Clark Gable trying to finish a film? Or was he finally, after 18 years, trying to finish something else? This is episode 6, the last film, the last Nevada sky, the last great performance of the king of Hollywood's life, and the last words he ever spoke about the woman he never stopped loving. The production of the Misfits assembled in Reno, Nevada in the summer of 1960 like a collection of beautiful, damaged things that had no business being in the same place at the same time. John Huston was directing, one of the great American filmmakers, a man of enormous talent and equally enormous appetites, who had made The Maltese Falcon and The Treasure of the Sierra Madre and The African Queen, and who brought to every project the particular energy of someone who had never quite learned the difference between adventure and self-destruction. Huston was also a gambler, a drinker, a man who believed that the best work came from pressure and discomfort and real stakes, which made him either the perfect or the worst possible director for this particular collection of people, depending on the day. He understood that what he had on his hands was not simply a difficult production. He understood that he was filming people who were running out of time. He chose to keep rolling. The screenplay was by Arthur Miller's Pulitzer Prize winner, one of the defining voices in American theater, the man who had written Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. He had written The Misfits specifically for his wife, Marilyn Monroe, as an act of love. A story built around her specific qualities, her vulnerability, her luminosity, her capacity to make broken things feel precious simply by being near them. He had spent years on it. By the time filming began, the marriage was disintegrating in full view of the cast and crew. Miller sat on set every day and watched his wife fall apart and wrote rewrites in the evenings and revised dialogue for scenes they would shoot the following week, with the quiet devastation of a man who understood exactly what was happening and could not stop any of it. Some evenings he rewrote scenes that were about the end of love for a woman who was living that ending in real time. The pages he handed to the cast in the mornings had been written in grief the night before. And then there was Marilyn Monroe herself. She was 34 years old. She was the most famous woman in the world. She was also in the grip of a personal crisis of such severity that filming had to be halted for weeks at a time while she recovered from breakdowns, hospitalizations, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being Marilyn Monroe for 15 years without ever finding a way to be anyone else. She arrived on set late, sometimes hours late, sometimes not at all. She forgot lines she had known the day before. She was simultaneously luminous and disintegrating, heartbreaking and impossible. And everyone on the production understood that they were watching something irreplaceable destroy itself in real time. Montgomery Clift was there too, another genius, another wreck, his face reconstructed after a devastating car accident, his body metabolizing alcohol and pills in combinations that alarmed his doctors and barely slowed him down on camera. And Clark Gable, 59 years old, the oldest one there. The last survivor of a Hollywood that no longer existed, he watched all of it with the careful, patient eyes of a man who had seen worse. And every morning he showed up on time. He had been given the role of a lifetime, because it was not really a role at all. Gay Langland, the character Gable played in The Misfits, was an aging Nevada cowboy who rounded up wild mustangs in the open desert. a man of skill and code and genuine physical capability in a world that had moved past the point of needing any of those things. A man who kept working because work was the only remaining structure that gave his days meaning. A man who loved the land and the sky and the vast indifferent distances of the American West because they asked nothing from him and offered silence in return. Gay Langland was also a man who had been left behind, a man whose world had changed around him while he stayed the same, a man carrying something heavy that he never quite named. Clark Gable did not need to research this character. He did not need to find motivation or construct an emotional backstory or reach into some technical reservoir of craft. Gay Langland was not a performance. Gay Langland was a recognition. The aging cowboy who had outlived his era, the man whose code still functioned perfectly in a world that no longer honored it. The man doing physical, real, dangerous work in open landscape because the alternative, sitting still, being quiet, letting the silence fill up with everything he had been carrying for 18 years, was not something he was prepared to do. Gable understood Gay Langland the way a man understands his own reflection. And so when the script called for Gable to do physical work, real physical work, not the choreographed approximations of action that most films offered, he did not hesitate and he did not delegate. He was going to do this honestly or not at all. Every morning the crew arrived on set wondering if today would be the day he finally said enough. That day never came. The physical demands of the Misfits were genuine. This was not a war film with carefully managed explosions at a safe distance. This was a Nevada desert production involving real horses, real ropes, real heat, and real physical confrontation between aging human bodies and large, terrified animals. The Mustang sequences were the most dangerous. Wild horses captured in the open desert, roped and restrained by men on the ground and in trucks. The animals fighting with the full, desperate power of creatures that did not understand what was happening to them and wanted nothing except to be free. Gable's role required him to handle these animals directly, roping them, being dragged across the desert floor behind a moving truck at the end of a rope, his body absorbing the impact of hard Nevada ground at speeds that would have tested a 25-year-old in perfect health. The rope burns on his hands were real. The bruises across his torso were real. The dust in his lungs at the end of each day was real. The temperature during filming regularly exceeded 100 degrees. There was no shade on the open desert floor. There was no relief from the sun and no compromise in what the script required. He was 59 years old. His cardiovascular system had been under sustained stress for 2 decades. The combat missions over Germany, the heavy drinking that had become a structural part of his daily life, the years of accumulated grief and sleeplessness, and a body that had been asked to carry more than bodies are built to carry. His physician had concerns serious enough to communicate them directly to the production. The production had a stunt double on payroll, a younger man, specifically hired and specifically capable, whose entire purpose was to absorb the most dangerous physical work so that the film was not at catastrophic risk if its lead actor was injured or killed in the Nevada desert. Gable refused to use him. Not dramatically, not with a speech about pride or professionalism or anything that could be quoted later. He simply declined, quietly and finally, and went back to work. When the director John Huston pushed back, and Huston was not a man who backed down easily, Gable was patient and immovable. He would do the work himself. That was not a negotiating position. That was a statement of fact. The crew watched him day after day and felt something they struggled to name. It was not simply admiration for his toughness, though the toughness was real and visible and impossible to dismiss. It was something more complicated, a sense that Gable was not performing bravery for the camera or the crew, a sense that the physical punishment, the heat, the horses, the rope burns, the exhaustion at the end of each brutal Nevada day, was serving some purpose that had nothing to do with the film. He was working something out. What it was, nobody asked directly, and he did not volunteer the answer. He watched her falling apart and never once lost patience. Those who were there never forgot it. The relationship between Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe on the set of the Misfits was one of the stranger and more moving things that summer produced. They were, in the most surface sense, opposites. He was the last relic of classical Hollywood, disciplined, punctual, professional to his bones, a man who had learned his work ethic in oil camps and poverty and had never lost it regardless of how famous he became. She was the chaos that the new Hollywood had produced, brilliant and self-destructive, incapable of protecting herself from her own fame, arriving hours late and leaving early and making every day of production a negotiation between her genius and her disintegration. Gable was never impatient with her. This surprised people. The crew expected friction, the old professional against the impossible star, the ticking clock of lost production days against his legendary punctuality. What they got instead was a kind of quiet, steady grace that the people who witnessed it found deeply moving. When Marilyn was late, Gable waited. When she forgot her lines, he ran them with her without comment. When she was at her most fragile, and there were days on that Nevada set when Marilyn Monroe seemed to be held together by almost nothing, Gable treated her with a gentleness that seemed to come from somewhere very deep in him. Those who knew him understood why, even if they didn't say it directly. He knew what it looked like when someone was carrying something unbearable. He had been carrying his own version of it for 18 years. He recognized the weight, and he was not going to make it heavier. He had been pushing the body past its limits for months. The body kept a precise account. Filming on the Misfits wrapped in early November 1960. Clark Gable had completed every scene, every take, every sequence that the script required of him, including the most brutal physical work of a career that had spanned 3 decades. He had done it in 100-degree heat with broken sleep and a cardiovascular system that had been under sustained assault for years. He had done it without a stunt double. He had done it while managing the chaos of a production that had been one crisis away from collapse for its entire duration. He had done it. 2 days after filming completed on November 5, 1960, Clark Gable was admitted to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. The diagnosis was a massive myocardial infarction, a heart attack of serious severity, the kind that kills men younger and healthier than he was, the kind that the body produces when it has finally exhausted every remaining reserve and simply stops cooperating. He was conscious. He was stable, in the early hours at least. Kay was with him, his wife, the woman who had spent 5 years trying to reach the part of him that was still reachable, who was also carrying the weight of an advanced pregnancy, their child due within weeks. She sat beside his bed and held his hand, and understood with the particular clarity that crisis produces that she was watching the end of something. She had always known on some level that she had married a man who was already partly somewhere else. Now she was watching him go the rest of the way. The doctors were cautious, but not without hope. Men survived heart attacks of this severity. It required rest, recovery, time. The 3 things Clark Gable had never been particularly willing to grant himself. He was not a man designed for stillness. His entire adult life had been organized around forward motion. Another film, another location, another obligation met, and another one waiting. Stillness meant silence. Silence meant the things he had been moving away from for 18 years. Now he had no choice but to be still. For 10 days he held on with the same stubborn, unhurried endurance that had defined everything he had done since 1942. He spoke to Kay. He was lucid in the long hours between sleep. He talked about the baby coming, the son he had not yet met, who would arrive into a world that his father was fighting to stay in. He talked about the Nevada desert. He talked about the film. He talked in the careful language of a man taking stock about a life that had been larger and stranger and more costly than anyone looking at it from the outside could fully understand. And in the quiet hours, in the language of the nearly lost, he talked about Carole. He had not spoken her name easily for 18 years. At the end, it was the name he came back to. Those present in the final days described the same thing in different words. Carole Lombard had never left him. Every marriage, every film, every night with the pistol on the nightstand, every brutal Nevada stunt refused to a double, every joyless professional performance delivered on time and on budget, all of it had been the life of a man who was somewhere else. A man who had been present in body and absent in soul since January 16th, 1942, when a TWA constellation went into a Nevada mountain and took the only irreplaceable thing he had ever found. He had lived 18 years in the space that loss created. He had filled the space with work and whiskey and marriages that were decent and insufficient, and the particular male endurance that doesn't ask for sympathy and doesn't receive it. He had done it with more dignity than most men could have managed and more pain than most people ever knew. At the end, in the hospital, the discipline finally came down. He spoke about her, about what she had been, about the specific, irreducible quality of her that nothing and nobody in 18 years had come close to replacing, about what it had meant to find once in a lifetime something that complete, and what it had cost to lose it. The people in that room carried what they heard for the rest of their lives. On November 16, 1960, 10 days after his admission to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, Clark Gable's heart stopped. He was 59 years old. He had completed his last film. He had said what needed to be said. In the weeks that followed, two things happened that together formed the final shape of Clark Gable's story. The Misfits was released in February 1961. It received strong reviews and would eventually be recognized as one of the finest American films of its era. A haunting, elegiac picture about people and landscapes running out of time. Gable's performance was universally praised. Critics who had written his career off as finished a decade earlier watched Gay Langland move through the Nevada desert and understood that they had been wrong. This was not the performance of a man going through motions. This was the performance of a man who had found at the very end a role that cost him something real. He never saw the reviews. And in December 1960, 6 weeks after Clark Gable died, Kay gave birth to their son, John Clark Gable, the child his father had never met. Born into the silence left by the king of Hollywood's exit Renwai carrying his name, entering a world that his father had already left. Clark Gable had made his last film. He had spoken his last words. He had left behind a son he never held and a legacy that would outlast everyone who had ever doubted him. And he had left behind one final instruction, written into his will, waiting to be honored. That instruction is the subject of the next episode, the last episode, the one that ends the way Clark Gable always wanted it to end. Next episode, Buried Next to Love, the finale.